Since I've been living in Vietnam for the past few years, my access to English books has been limited. I could always find some English books, but it was difficult to track down specific titles. But now that I'm back in the United States and can track down any book I want to through interlibrary loan, one of the things I want to start doing on this channel is tracking down books that made a big impact on me in my younger days and talking about them on this channel. And so, through the magic of interlibrary loan, I have here before you The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge, which had a huge impact on me when I was younger. So, if you'll indulge me, the story went like this. When I was in 6th grade, my cousins got into Greek mythology, and they had a number of Greek mythology books around their house. I was visiting them one summer, and I naturally gravitated towards the hero-type stuff, the books about Hercules or heroes fighting dragons or something like that. Now, my cousins encouraged me to check out the Trojan War books, but I was not interested at all. I thought, okay, I already know the story. It's about some guys going into a wooden horse and tricking the Trojans. It doesn't sound like that interesting of a story. I already know how it ends. And I thought that was the I thought that was the story of the Trojan War. I didn't know that there was any more to it. But a few months later, I was in my school library and I saw this book on the shelves, The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge. Now, from an adult perspective, this actually doesn't look like it's that long of a book. But when I was in 6th grade, this is some 233 pages. This seemed like it was a hefty chunk of a book. And I thought, I thought the Trojan War was just about this fake wooden horse that the Greeks used to trick the Trojans. I didn't know there was that much story to the Trojan War. And so, being thus intrigued, I checked this book out of my school library and was amazed by how many twists and turns there were to the story. It wasn't just about a wooden horse. That was just one episode of the Trojan War. There were many more episodes of personality conflicts and fights between heroes and the gods and miraculous events. And I found it disturbing, but fascinating. Now, I say disturbing because this being my first exposure to the Trojan War and perhaps my first serious exposure to Greek myths, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Who am I supposed to be rooting for? I got the impression that I was supposed to be rooting for the Greeks because the Trojans, when they were portrayed, usually came off as weak or cowardly or sneaky, whereas the Greek heroes were the much more appealing set of heroes. I guess Hector being the exception on the Trojan side, although even Hector was often portrayed simply as the antagonist to the Greek heroes. And yet, the whole tone of the book, well, it seemed to be switching back and forth between who I was supposed to be considered sympathetic from chapter to chapter. The tone of the book had these great fight scenes between different heroes, but it also was very tragic in its view of the violence and the effects of war, particularly on the children and the women in the besieged city. I had not, that's the Trojan War for you, right? That's Greek mythology or ancient literature. But I think that was the first time I really had to grapple with a book like that and figure out, okay, there's some really interesting stories here. Like most young boys, I was fascinated by war and violence. It's unfortunate, but there it is. But yeah, I found it fascinating, if confusing. And like I said, this book had a big impact on me. Because of this book, I became very interested in the Trojan War. Because I became very interested in the Trojan War, well, I ended up reading the Iliad by Homer. This is the copy of the Iliad by Homer that I read when I was in 7th grade, the next year. I became fascinated with Greek mythology in general. Because I was fascinated with Greek mythology in general, I became interested in ancient history in general, which is why I studied Latin in high school instead of Spanish. For better or for worse. Maybe I should have studied Spanish. It probably would have been a lot more useful for me. But I was very interested in the Greeks and the Romans, so I signed up for Latin at my high school for my language elective. And, ancient Greece, of course, wasn't offered at the high school level. And I entered into college as a classics major for studying ancient Greece and Rome. I didn't stick with it. Halfway through my sophomore year, I changed to a general history major. As you do when you're young, You're still trying to figure out what exactly your area is. But for several years, I thought my area was ancient Greece and Rome largely because of this book. Set me on that path. So I was eager to revisit it. Another reason I want to talk about this book is I've talked on this channel before about the Iliad. And I've said in my review of the Iliad that if you don't know anything about the Trojan War, you actually don't want to jump into the Iliad, because the Iliad starts right in the middle of the story. And in fact, in this volume here, we can see this is the story of the Trojan War. The Iliad starts here. So page 69 in this book is where the events of the Iliad start. And the events of the Iliad stop here. And then these are the events after the Iliad. So this book provides not only a good introduction to the Trojan War, but a good explanation of the events both before and after the Iliad. So you would want to read this book before you would read the Iliad, in my opinion. Don't definitely read this book before you attempt the Iliad if you don't know anything about the Trojan War. You could also just go to Wikipedia, but this is book 2. We're all bookish people. We like to read books, so read this book. It's an old book. It was published originally in 1952. Now, this version here with these cover illustrations looks almost exactly the same as the one that was in my school library. I think the one in my school library was hardcover, if I remember correctly, and this is soft cover. But other than that, this is exactly the same book, which was, I guess, reissued in 1980. And I think since then it's been reissued as well. You can buy it on Amazon easily enough, and you should also be able to find it at your local library through interlibrary loan. So in my case, they didn't have this book at my local library, and they didn't have this book in my district library. So I had to go through the state library. In my state library, I think, had something like 29 copies of this book available across the state. So it was very easily accessible through interlibrary loan once you get to the state level. I don't know if the systems differ from state to state, but point being, it's an older book, but you can track it down easily. Like I said, I would definitely recommend this book as a precursor to anyone who's thinking about tackling the Iliad. But let me know in the comments down below if you know of another good introduction to the Trojan War. This is the best one I'm familiar with in terms of giving the broadest foundational knowledge about all the events and characters of the Trojan War. But if you know something else, let me know in the comments. Anyways, To the best of my knowledge, I only read this book once when I was in 6th grade. It took me a while. I don't remember exactly how long, but I remember having this book with me for quite some time. As an adult, I read it in like a couple days. It's only 233 pages, lots of illustration, big font size. I guess that's the difference between reading this as a 6th grader and reading this as an adult. The illustrations here, which are done by Edward Sandoz, again, are the same illustrations I remember as a kid. And it is interesting to me how much these illustrations have stayed in my memory. It's just interesting how stuff imprints on your brain when you're young, isn't it? I only read this book once, as far as I can remember, but I don't remember every sentence of it. As I was rereading it now, the actual paragraphs and sentences were not, I didn't have those memorized. But certainly I remember what was in each chapter. I more or less remember the order of the chapters, and I remembered the illustrations, almost all of them, perfectly. It's like I just saw them, had just seen them yesterday. What I remember and what I don't remember from my childhood is probably only of interest to me. So let me talk about the book in general. So the book starts off with the prologue of the Golden Apple. And again, this was something that fascinated me as a kid, how this whole story of the Trojan War can be traced back to one wedding and the fallout from that one wedding. So it starts out very small, but then the events get bigger and bigger. These illustrations, again, I think for the most part are pretty good. This is the Judgment of Paris here. I was pleasantly surprised to discover upon rereading this how good the prose was. It's got kind of a storybook type quality to it, but it's very pleasant to read. So as an example of that, let me give you part here from chapter 2, Helen, on pages 12 and 13. This is Menelaus talking to Paris. "You must sing for us after the feast," said he. "If your skill with the lyre matches your voice, we shall think ourselves lucky indeed. Our minstrel is old, so that the queen grows weary of his songs and keeps to her room. Without her, gloom descends on my hall." "I have some skills in music," admitted the young man. "Indeed, Hector, my brother, declares I spend too much time with my lyre and neglect the weapons of war. I am a fair shot with a bow, but it is true that I was reared in the mountains and never trained with spear or sword." "Each man has a different gift," said the warrior king with tolerant contempt. "Indeed, that is so," replied Paris earnestly. "Hector's gift is prowess in war. Mine is mere grace and beauty, yet you should not despise it, since it alone is not born of practice, but comes unsought direct from the blessed gods. No man can win it to whom it has not been given." "Best of all are the gifts of the gods," said the king mechanically, but his eyes were already on the doorway, where a little bustle of servants marked the arrival of his wife. Etc. It goes on, of course, but I'll stop there. You get the idea. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think she's copying directly from any ancient source here. I think this is the ancient sources give us an idea of the meeting between Paris and Helen, but I think she's inventing the dialogues and inventing the descriptions there, and doing a good job for the most part. There are Yeah. So I did check Goodreads and Amazon beforehand to see what other people thought of this book. And the reviews are overwhelmingly positive. There are a lot of people who are in a situation similar to me where they said this was one of their favorite books as a kid, or this was a book that introduced them to the Trojan War as a kid and they were revisiting it. I did see some people complaining about it. Yeah, I guess if you did want to make some complaints, some of it does have an episodic quality to it. So the author here is attempting to marshal all the different stories about the Trojan War. I mean, not all of them, but I guess all the major stories about the Trojan War. Some of these chapters lead into each other, particularly the ones that recount the Iliad. But some of them are a little bit more episodic in quality. There is, particularly, I guess, at the close of the war, it does seem to have the feeling of a bunch of random incidents before the end of the war. And there's a bunch of things that the Greeks need to do before Troy falls. So, they need to get the son of Achilles before Troy will fall. And they need to get the bow of Hercules before Troy will fall. And they need to steal the Palladium from inside Troy before Troy will fall. It feels like some sort of video game where they have to go on all these random quests in order to win the war. I think this is probably because these were all different stories that had accumulated all over time in the ancient world. When you put them all right next to each other, it does kind of feel a little bit silly. Also, some of these episodes, the format of the book is that each chapter is only a few pages, and each chapter recounts an episode. For some of these episodes, that format works quite well, like, the taking of Helen from chapter 2, which I was just quoting from. That chapter is quite well done. For other of these episodes, you get the sense that the author is a little bit overwhelmed by all the events she has to cram into one chapter, and the endings to them can feel a little bit rushed. Like I said, I'm largely just giving these criticisms as trying to understand why somebody else who wasn't me wouldn't like this book. I love this book. Was fascinated by it as a kid and came back to it as an adult to discover it was largely as I imagined it. So looking at these individual episodes, we have, one of the great things about this book is it really does. It's a short book, but it really does have the major points of the Trojan War. So it has, for example, Troilus and Cressida, which a lot of other retellings of the Trojan War leave out, because this is a story that is actually not from ancient Greece. This came about in the Middle Ages. I believe Chaucer was the first one, and then Shakespeare had a play on Troilus and Cressida. This isn't part of the original Trojan War, but it is part of the expanded Trojan War. There's no reason why, if we're talking about the legacy of the Trojan War over all of Western literature, there's no reason why we have to stop with the Greeks. Here's a medieval addition to the Trojan War. Now, the author nowhere in the text gives any hint that this is a later medieval edition. You'd have to go to Wikipedia to find out that information. And indeed, when I was originally reading this in 6th grade, I had no idea that Troilus and Cressida was not part of the original story. That's one of those things you find out later in life, etc. Another thing that this book does that a lot of other books on the Trojan War don't do, retellings of the Trojan War, is it spotlights the story of Palamedes, who figures relatively prominently in this story. Palamedes is the one who tricked Odysseus into showing that he wasn't mad. Odysseus was trying to pretend that he was mad to avoid going to the Trojan War. Palamedes tricked Odysseus into revealing that he wasn't mad by putting his baby in front of the oxen, forcing Odysseus to reveal that he was still actually quite sane when he stopped the oxen and saved his baby's life. And then, I guess spoilers here, Odysseus later takes his revenge by framing Palamedes for treachery and getting Palamedes killed. I remember that because, well, like I said, I was young enough the first time I read this book that it really imprinted itself on me. So all the stories in this book I remembered quite well through later life. Again, it's funny how when you're young, you just remember stuff really good. And it's somewhat sad that as you get older, that window seems to have been closed. So, books I read now, I will not remember as well in 20 years as books I read when I was 12. But that's how it is, huh? Anyways. Because I read this when I was young, I always remembered the story of Palamedes and was always puzzled when other books on the Trojan War seemed to leave that part out completely. Although if you read a really thorough introduction to Greek mythology, like the one I reviewed a few months ago, the Routledge Handbook of Greek Myths, then they will talk about it. And Palamedes shows up in some of the old Greek plays, etc. But he doesn't seem to show up in a lot of modern retellings of it. Aside from those two incidents I just named, Palamedes gets name-dropped a few times in the early chapters. And also, Palamedes' father takes revenge on the Greeks when they are trying to come home. This is part of the stories in the returns. Most of those who perished were lured into the rocks by Palamedes' father, Nauplus, who lit beacon lights to deceive the ships seeking shelter from the storm. Nauplus did this in vengeance for his son's death, which we all know came about through the agency of Odysseus. This is something that, this is, closing the story of Palamedes. Anyways, enough about Palamedes. He's a relatively minor figure, but it's just one of the interesting things about this book. As well as, the whole thing about after the Iliad. So the Iliad, the events of the Iliad stop here at page 122. And then a lot of retellings of the Trojan War don't go on to talk about what happens next, like the fight with the Amazons, or the fight with Memnon, the son of the dawn, or the madness of Ajax when he loses the armor of Achilles, or Achilles' son, Pyrrhus, coming to join the fight. The death of Paris after he gets hit with a poison arrow, etc. So, this book does a very good job of including a lot of the major stories of the Trojan War. Now, it doesn't include everything, and this is what I discovered many years ago when I was younger. So when I first read this in 6th grade, I thought to myself, okay, 237 pages. This has got to be everything about the Trojan War. Now I know everything. And then, of course, I discovered, as you do, that there were a whole lot more details and more stories that were not included in here. So, for example, the Iliad has chapters about the gods joining in the fighting along with the mortals, and how Athena guides Diomedes' chariot, and how Ares, the god of war, joins in the fight with the Trojans. None of that's in here, which I don't know. Maybe it should have been. If I had been alive in 1952 and I was the editor for Olivia Coolidge, maybe I would have said, let's add just one more chapter here in the section on the wrath of Achilles about the gods fighting in the war. That would be a fun chapter to include. But yeah, it's not in there, and there are other details which are not in here. The Return of the Heroes is in here. Odysseus's mini adventures are not in here, although they're alluded to. But then Odysseus' return home and his fighting with the suitors is in here in chapters 4 and 5 of the 6th section. Yeah. Like I said, when I was a kid, I found this book and this whole story completely fascinating, largely because I didn't know anything about it before picking this up, other than the story of the Trojan horse, and that I only knew like from cartoons. Like I only didn't know any of the details. And then reading through this was completely fascinated. And like I said, I think boys might be more fascinated by this story than girls, just because it's a story about war. I mean, not to stereotype, but that is kind of how it is sometimes. And yet the author, Olivia Coolidge, is a woman. So, maybe I shouldn't be stereotyping. But I did go to Goodreads and Amazon before filming this review. And there were... apparently this book is assigned reading in some schools, which makes sense to me. It wasn't assigned reading in my school. I just found it in the school library on my own initiative. But I think to myself, it's the kind of book that should be assigned reading in schools, right? I mean, maybe the Iliad should be assigned reading in schools, but in this day and age, you could never assign the Iliad. It's too dense and too long to be required reading in secondary schools. But this gives all the necessary background to the Iliad that you would need, covers most of the major events in the Iliad. So if you would read this short book, you would have all the cultural knowledge that you would need to understand the Trojan War. So it should be assigned reading in schools, I thought. But there were a lot of students complaining. Sorry, not a lot. There were some. Some students complaining about how their teacher made them read this really boring book. And made me a little bit sad to read that. But, of course, you always have to figure, okay, not everyone is interested in all the same stuff I'm interested in. And maybe for girls, this story wouldn't hold quite the same fascination that violence does for young boys. Or am I wrong? Am I being sexist? Let me know in the comments. How interested are you in these types of stories? Do you think gender makes a difference, etc.? So I'm going to leave it off there. This is a strong recommend for me. I know from going to Goodreads and Amazon that not everyone likes it, but I really liked it, and for whatever my recommendation is worth, I strongly recommend you check this out. It is young adult. So, it's geared towards the reading level of a 6th grader. But even as an adult, if you're not familiar with this story and you want to read the Iliad, just get this out of your library first. Request it through interlibrary loan. Even though it's a young adult book, there's no shame in that. It will give you all the necessary background information that you would need to read the Iliad. And then after reading this book, then you can go into the Iliad.